17 years of silence. The moment Richard Ames heard his name called over the intercom, he knew something was off. It wasn't the sound of his manager's voice. It was the stillness that followed. After 17 years working at Alderwood Systems in Des Moines, Iowa, silence had become more telling than words. He rose slowly from his desk, every movement rehearsed by habit, closing a spreadsheet, straightening the notepad where he logged every system issue, pocketing the same pen he'd carried since the Bush administration. As he walked past the server racks, humming softly like trusted old friends, his team barely glanced up. Too young to recognize the tremor in the air, too busy with sprint tickets and Slack messages to understand what was about to happen. Upstairs, Thomas Kinley from operations was already waiting. He didn't even pretend to smile. Across the table sat Miranda from HR, laptop open, lips pressed tight like someone bracing for a wave. "We're restructuring," Thomas said without hesitation. "Your role has been eliminated, effective today." Richard didn't flinch. "Understood." Not a word more. Not a question, not a plea. Just those two syllables that seemed to land heavier than any argument. As he made his way back down to the basement-level IT room, the one he'd kept organized since the company had less than 50 employees, Richard saw what he hadn't wanted to believe these past few weeks. The cold stares, the avoidance, the sudden disappearance of emails that used to land in his inbox daily. He had already been erased. This meeting just made it official. He packed methodically, just like he lived. A photo of his wife Margaret at their cabin in Minnesota. A faded ceramic mug his daughter Emma made in 8th grade. The little bonsai tree he'd somehow kept alive under harsh, fluorescent lights for almost 2 decades. He wasn't angry, but there was something deeper, older than anger, something colder, the kind of silence that settles into the bones when a man gives everything and is dismissed with a form letter in a 2-minute meeting. Lori, a marketing manager he'd helped troubleshoot during her first year, approached him near the elevator. "Richard, I just heard, are they out of their minds? You basically built this network." He gave a small smile. "It's not personal, it's just change. Companies like to reinvent themselves." "But not like this," she said, her voice cracking. "Not like this." He pressed the elevator button. "Take care of that printer in room 204. It's going to jam again." She nodded, wiping her eyes. As he stepped out of the building, Richard didn't look back. He'd given them 17 years, through network crashes, hardware overhauls, and Christmas outages when no one else picked up the phone. 3 CEOs, 6 product line pivots, and hundreds of employees had come and gone. He stayed. He wasn't the loudest or the most ambitious, but he was the one who kept things running when no one noticed. The one who wrote the custom scripts that everyone relied on but never understood. He was the man who knew where everything lived and how it all connected. Not because he was a genius, because he cared. That was his real mistake. He had believed that quiet reliability mattered more than visibility. As Richard placed his company badge on the passenger seat of his Buick, he stared at it for a moment. It had been replaced 4 times over the years, each new version with a shinier plastic coating, but the same old name underneath. No farewell lunch, no recognition, just silence. The air felt different now. Colder, yes, but also clearer. He wasn't bitter, but something had been set in motion the moment they assumed he'd walk away quietly. They had underestimated the quiet man, and for the first time in years, Richard felt something stir. Not vengeance, not even justice, just clarity. Wednesday, he thought. Wednesday would be interesting. The house felt too quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. Richard Ames sat in the worn leather chair of his home office, the same one he'd used for years when working late nights remotely for Alderwood Systems. But this time, there was no project deadline, no emergency server crash to fix, just silence, and a strange stillness that settled into his bones. Margaret, his wife of 28 years, knocked gently before entering, holding a glass of iced tea. "Anything you need?" she asked. He looked up briefly. "Just some space, hon. I'll be out in a bit." She gave him a soft nod and stepped out without a word. After all these years, she understood his silences better than his explanations. Richard turned back to the laptop on the desk. It wasn't company property. This one was his. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd made subtle preparations, backup folders, archived logs, nothing illegal, nothing that would trip any alarms, just cautious because something hadn't felt right for a while. It had started small, little things. His administrator access, once complete and unrestricted, had begun to quietly change. Subtle limits placed on file paths he used daily, credentials mysteriously failing, and then accidentally restored after IT claimed it was a glitch. Then came the meetings. He stopped being invited to key upgrade planning sessions. He was no longer CC'd on emails about system infrastructure or vendor contracts. Projects he'd normally oversee were quietly handed off to junior staff who didn't even understand the architecture he built. The final sign came when he stumbled upon a company-wide announcement buried in an internal bulletin, one that outlined a modernization initiative restructuring the entire IT department under new leadership. His name wasn't on the new chart. At first, Richard thought it was a clerical mistake. Then he realized it was intentional. He wasn't just being phased out, he was being erased. That same evening, while running a routine diagnostic on his personal records, a habit built over years of meticulous discipline, he noticed something odd in the mirrored audit logs he had permission to retain. A series of routine financial transfers to an outside vendor named Brightwave Analytics LLC. It wasn't the name that bothered him, it was the regularity. Monthly disbursements, each one slightly larger than the last, starting innocuously at $8,200 and climbing to over $27,000 per month. The listed service was for cloud monitoring optimization. The vendor had only been added to Alderwood's approved vendor list within the last 14 months. Curious, Richard did a quick search. Brightwave Analytics was registered to a tiny P.O. box in suburban Phoenix. No website, no staff, just a name and an EIN number. Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but in IT, patterns always told a story, and this one was starting to whisper something foul. He cross-checked internal approval records, something he still had access to for now, and found that every payment had been signed off by Harvey Lang, the company's chief financial officer. Not surprising. What was surprising was the name listed as Brightwave's registered owner. Russell Lang, Harvey's younger cousin. Richard sat back, a low breath escaping through his nose. A pattern had formed, and if the numbers were correct, the company had been funneling close to $400,000 through an operation that had no actual digital infrastructure. No code, no data logs, just inflated invoices for services that didn't exist. He said nothing to Margaret that night. No need to worry her until he understood more. But when he lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling fan turn slow circles overhead, he knew something had shifted inside him. This wasn't just about being let go. This was about something wrong, something dirty, and he was no longer inside the system, which meant he could finally see it clearly. The next morning, he poured his coffee black, sat down at his desk again, and began to build a quiet case, not out of revenge, but because, for 17 years, he had safeguarded Alderwood's data, protected it from outside threats. Now it seemed the biggest threat had come from within. Richard Ames had never thought of himself as the suspicious type. He believed in doing his job well, following procedure, trusting that if you kept the wheels turning quietly, you earned your place over time. But trust was no longer an option. It was nearly midnight when he slid open the bottom drawer of his home desk, pulling out a black flash drive the size of a matchstick. He had 3 more just like it, redundant, encrypted, each tucked away in different locations. Years ago, during a legal compliance project, he had advised the company to keep off-site data redundancy in case of internal compromise. The legal team had signed off without much discussion, too focused on avoiding lawsuits to worry about the implications. No one had remembered it since, until now. He plugged the drive into his laptop. It chirped once. Then came the cascade of folders, mirrored archives of Alderwood's most sensitive operational logs, change records, access permissions, transaction approvals, email backups, things a regular analyst would never see, things no one should have kept. But Richard had, because he knew the system, and because somewhere along the way, Alderwood had stopped knowing him. He started with the Brightwave payments, the fake vendor tied to the CFO's cousin. The numbers were worse than he thought. Not only had the payments increased monthly, but they had also lined up almost perfectly with Alderwood's legitimate software license renewals. The trick was clever. Instead of inventing completely fake expenses, which could be flagged in an audit, Harvey Lang and his circle had marked up real services through Brightwave, essentially inflating the price of actual tools by 15 to 25%. Just high enough to skim serious money, just low enough to avoid scrutiny. Richard's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. It was an old rhythm, but his hands still remembered. Next, he traced the approval chain. Harvey's name was on every request, but another one kept appearing in shadows. Thomas Kinley, Richard's former manager, the man who had let him go without blinking. At first, Thomas hadn't signed anything directly, but Richard noticed a curious coincidence. Every time a Brightwave payment was processed, Thomas's department received a budget bump. Small but consistent. A reward, perhaps? Or hush money? Then something else caught Richard's attention. A batch of emails from 6 months earlier. Not between Harvey or Thomas, but involving Greg Sullivan, Alderwood's new tech transformation consultant. The man with the polished suits and vague PowerPoint slides. Richard had assumed Greg was just another outsider hired to clean house. But these emails told a different story. Greg hadn't been hired through standard channels. There was no RFP, no interview process. Just a direct award contract, signed off by Harvey, of course, and pushed through in a closed-door executive session. And the timing? 2 weeks after Richard's internal access had begun, quietly disappearing. Richard sat back. His shoulders were tense, but his mind was clear. This wasn't about incompetence. This was deliberate. He hadn't been laid off because of company strategy. He'd been removed because he was in the way. The consultant's job hadn't been to modernize. It was to sanitize, to eliminate the one person who understood how the digital foundations really worked. The one man who could detect the bleed. Richard leaned forward again. He opened a new folder on his desktop and began building a report. Not just a list of suspicions, evidence, clean, documented, unmistakable. Payment history with timestamps. Internal memos showing access modification orders. Emails hinting at coordination between Harvey, Thomas, and Greg. Proof of financial gain tied directly to budget increases. And the best part? All of it would be backed by system logs. Immutable, time-stamped, legally admissible. He paused once, staring out the window. Des Moines lay quiet under a thin winter fog. His neighborhood was still. His wife had gone to bed an hour ago. His phone buzzed only once, a message from an old colleague. Heard what happened. It's not right. Miss having you here. Richard didn't answer. He wasn't done yet. Not with what he had, not with what they'd done, and certainly not before someone had to answer for it. Richard Ames wasn't impulsive by nature. He liked plans. He respected process. But as he reviewed the growing mountain of evidence against Alderwood's top executives, he realized something chilling. These people hadn't just been skimming money. They'd built an entire system to silence anyone who might get too close. And for years, he'd been the only one close enough to see it. He stared at the email draft on his screen for nearly 10 minutes. It was addressed to Alderwood's board of directors. Attached was a summary of his findings. Vendor records, inflated payments, unauthorized access approvals. Everything was clear. Everything was damning. But it also looked like revenge. Coming from a recently terminated employee, it would be easy to dismiss as sour grapes. A bitter former tech guy airing grievances. He deleted the draft. This had to be cleaner. He needed a move that would cause panic, but not expose his full hand. Not yet. Richard opened an old hidden email account he'd once created for internal penetration testing. An unlisted address that mimicked Alderwood's domain, but existed completely outside the company's ecosystem. He typed up a new message, short and strategic. Subject: Financial irregularities, urgent review needed to Thomas Kinley. CC: Harvey Langbody. Thomas. While reviewing old systems documentation, I came across discrepancies regarding vendor payments tied to Brightwave Analytics. The numbers don't align with services rendered. Suggest internal audit before this becomes a bigger issue. RA, no threats, no accusations, just a quiet push. He hit send. Then he waited. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, his phone buzzed. A voicemail from Thomas. He didn't pick up. Richard, we really need to talk. This is serious. Call me back as soon as you can. By noon, a second message came. This one from Alderwood's HR director, Janine Mullins. The tone was much colder. Mr. Ames, you are reminded of your post-termination confidentiality agreement. Any attempt to contact current employees or share internal documentation may be considered a legal violation. Richard smirked. He had signed nothing. He'd been dismissed abruptly. No severance, no paperwork, no NDA. They were bluffing, trying to intimidate him into silence. But the real confirmation came that evening, when Margaret answered the door and found a man in a charcoal gray suit asking for Richard by name. Tell him Greg Sullivan stopped by. It's urgent. She told him her husband was unavailable and closed the door without another word. When Richard came downstairs and heard the name, he paused. Greg, the consultant, the outsider who'd engineered his removal. They were scrambling now. He went into the garage, opened his small fireproof safe, and retrieved a secondary hard drive he hadn't touched in years. It contained logs that predated Brightwave Analytics entirely. Old code, original architecture records, and a change tracking system he'd built into the financial dashboard over a decade ago. It hadn't been disabled. They'd just forgotten it existed. It was all there. Timestamps, approval trails, even login metadata tied to Harvey Lang's personal credentials. And it showed something else. Someone had been accessing the system at unusual hours. Midnight logins, weekend pushes, quiet, consistent manipulations. Greg's laptop IP had shown up twice. Richard knew what that meant. The consultant wasn't just there to streamline. He had been actively adjusting internal controls. That night, Richard sat on his back porch, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching the last amber light of day fade behind the neighboring rooftops. He wasn't angry, not in the way he expected to be. What he felt now was focus, pure and sharp. They had built their scheme on one assumption, that he would disappear quietly, that his loyalty would keep him silent, that his age made him harmless. They were wrong. Tomorrow was Thursday, and he had more than evidence now. He had momentum. By the time Richard Ames woke up Thursday morning, he'd already made up his mind. He wasn't going to warn them again. The game had changed. The night before, he'd uploaded his full investigative file to 3 encrypted cloud locations, each with a timed release protocol. If something happened to him, the data would go straight to the IRS, the SEC, and 2 prominent business reporters. A digital dead man's switch. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. After breakfast, Richard drove 15 miles out of Des Moines to a small diner where he knew the Wi-Fi was slow, the coffee was decent, and the booths were always half empty before lunch. He settled into a corner seat and opened his laptop. There was one more step to take. From his secure account, he drafted a new message, this time to someone who could actually do something. Robert Denning, a semi-retired board member he once worked with during a cybersecurity overhaul 8 years ago. A man who still read audit reports line by line. A man who listened. Subject: critical financial review, urgent and confidential attachment. Full forensic summary. Brightwave, Sullivan, Lang. Message: Robert, I don't expect favors. I don't want my job back. But I do believe you care about the company's integrity. What's attached may explain why Thomas Kinley and Harvey Lang have been unusually tense in recent board meetings. I'm not asking for action. I'm asking for awareness. Regards, Richard Ames. He hit send. Then he waited. An hour later, his phone rang. Unfamiliar number. He answered. Richard? The voice was steady but cautious. It's Robert Denning. I've read what you sent. I need to see you. Today. They met in a public park, seated at a bench beneath a wide oak tree. Richard handed him a sealed envelope with a printed copy of the summary and a USB drive. Denning flipped through the pages in silence, his eyes narrowing with each line. This explains a lot, he murmured. The finance committee has been getting stonewalled for months. I figured it was just inefficiency. It's not, Richard said quietly. It's fraud. Coordinated, deep, and deliberate. Is this all of it? No, Richard replied. It's what you need to start. Denning stared at him. Why come to me? Because I've seen you fight for things that didn't benefit you, Richard answered. That's rare at your level. Denning nodded slowly. There's a finance subcommittee meeting tomorrow morning. Convenient timing. Richard stood. Use it. That afternoon, Richard ignored 4 calls from Alderwood, 1 from HR, 1 from Greg Sullivan, 2 from unknown numbers. His inbox lit up with vague legal threats. He said nothing, did nothing. At 7:45 p.m., a text came through from a former colleague still on the inside. Security just escorted Harvey and Thomas into private conference rooms. Board's calling emergency session tomorrow. People are whispering. What's going on? Richard didn't reply. By midnight, he'd scheduled a second email, this time addressed to every board member directly, set to send at 8 a.m., sharp Friday morning. Subject line, before you approve Q2 bonuses, read this. Attached was everything, the fraud, the falsified vendors, the backdoor payments, the role of Greg Sullivan. When he finally closed the laptop and stepped outside, Margaret was waiting for him on the porch with a blanket and a cup of warm tea. You look like you just finished a war, she said, handing him the mug. He exhaled slowly. Not finished, but the tide just turned. They sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked, Are you safe? He looked into her eyes, steady and calm. I'm safer now than I've ever been, because I'm not the one hiding anymore. Across town, executives scrambled. Files were being pulled, emails deleted, phone calls made in whispers. They had spent years thinking no one saw. They forgot about the quiet man who saw everything. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of Iowa spring day that made the city feel briefly innocent again. Richard Ames sat on the porch in a navy blazer he hadn't worn in years, a quiet cup of black coffee cradled in his hands. At exactly 8 a.m., the email he had scheduled was delivered to every member of Alderwood Systems Board of Directors. No more hints, no more shadows. This time, they got everything. By 8:17, his phone buzzed. Unknown numbers, assistants, legal. He ignored everyone. At 9 o'clock, the board's Emergency Finance Committee convened. Inside that quiet, climate-controlled conference room, Robert Denning laid out the report Richard had handed him in the park. Every page, every connection, every dollar, and the room, once full of nodding executives, turned cold with realization. At 9:32, a text from his old colleague flashed on Richard's screen. Police are here. Lang and Kinley being questioned. Sullivan looks like he's about to vomit. What did you do? Richard smiled faintly but typed no reply. The system was correcting itself. By 10 o'clock, the company's general counsel, Elaine Rhodes, called. She was one of the few people Richard chose to answer. Mr. Ames, she began, voice composed but clipped. The board is taking your evidence extremely seriously. Multiple executives have been placed on leave. Forensic auditors are being brought in. I'm glad to hear that, he said calmly. We would appreciate your cooperation, perhaps an in-person meeting. No, he replied. Everything you need is already in that report. Anything else is in secure locations, already prepared for release if I go missing, or if my wife gets harassed at the grocery store. Silence. We understand, she said eventually. There's also another matter. I'm listening. The board would like to extend an offer, formally, not to return to your old position, but to accept a newly created executive role, Chief Information Security Officer. You would report directly to the board. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, stretched his back, and looked out over the neighborhood he and Margaret had called home for nearly 3 decades. It wasn't revenge that settled in his chest now. It was something more durable. Resolution. At 2 p.m., Robert Denning called again. No pleasantries this time. It's a bloodbath, he said. Lang confessed once we laid out the pattern. He's trying to pin it all on Kinley. Kinley's denying everything. Sullivan says he was just a consultant and never touched finances, but the board isn't buying it. And the damage? Richard asked. Roughly $5.4 million, give or take, Denning replied. More may turn up. but we'll recover most of it, thanks to your early evidence trail. Now, about that role, Richard cut in. You'll have my response by Monday. He hung up and turned to find Margaret waiting in the doorway, arms crossed gently. That sounded serious. It was. And what do you want to do? Richard considered her question long after she'd gone back inside. That evening, he sat in his office and drafted a single post to his dormant LinkedIn profile. Never burn bridges. Just let them collapse under the weight of their own greed. Within minutes, old colleagues, former vendors, even quiet competitors began reaching out. By Monday morning, Richard walked into Alderwood Systems, not through the basement IT doors where he'd spent 17 years, but through the main lobby, greeted by security with a firm handshake and a respectful nod. Welcome back, Mr. Ames. The boardroom was silent when he entered. Denning gave him a nod. The interim CEO, flushed and tense, addressed him. Mr. Ames, thank you for what you've done. The board has unanimously approved your appointment as Chief Information Security Officer. Your terms were reviewed and accepted. Richard opened his folder. Inside were 3 requests, already agreed to. Full audit authority across all departments. An independent technology budget not subject to executive veto. Absolute discretion to override digital procurement approvals. This is unusual, the interim CEO said hesitantly. So was stealing $5.4 million, Richard replied. Silence followed. At 11:47 a.m., Richard signed his offer. 6 months later, he sat in his new corner office, overlooking downtown Des Moines. The skies were clear, the system secure. His team reported to him now, including Stephen, the young analyst he'd once mentored. Stephen had potential. He just needed someone who saw it. A knock on the door pulled Richard from his thoughts. Margaret stood there smiling. Ready for lunch? He grabbed his coat and walked with her through the building. This time the whispers weren't of pity or politics. They were whispers of respect, and as they stepped out into the sunlight, Richard Ames knew. He hadn't just exposed a broken system, he'd rebuilt a stronger one. Sometimes the quietest people hold the most power, not because they seek attention, but because they pay attention. Richard's story reminds us that integrity, patience, and preparation are not weaknesses. They're strengths that reveal themselves when it matters most. In a world that often overlooks loyalty and experience, never underestimate your own value. When treated unfairly, don't react with rage. Respond with wisdom. Truth has a way of rising, especially when someone like Richard is willing to stand firm and let the facts speak for themselves.